sun's gone to hell. Moon riding high. Let me bid you farewell. Every man has to die, but it's written in the stars. In every line in your palm, we're fools to make war on our brothers in arms.
That he's gone soft. Well, philosophy comes from the new Peace University in Berlin, where all kinds of people learn how to make the world a better place.
The idea of the Peace University is to bring together people who normally don't meet. So people from politics, from economy, from science. There will be a lot of Nobel laureates for physics and chemistry and economy and so on. But also people from different cultures, Buddhists, Christian, American Indians, Hindus, to a fruitful dialogue.
A unique selection of people came together to talk about various aspects of peace, bringing together political and spiritual awareness in the hope of developing new forms of cooperation. Adam Yauka, the Beastie Boys, was one of the students.
And when I was invited and when I heard all who was going to be here, I just thought it would be really incredible to come. They're not only talking about outer peace, like peace as a word, meaning that there aren't any wars going on, but inner peace, which is the thing that brings that about. I mean, when you hear somebody like His Holiness Dalai Lama speak, well, for me, it's real powerful.
Try to reduce negative emotion and try to increase this positive emotion. That is usually I call the inner disarmament. See, inner spiritual development is the basis of genuine lasting world peace.
In order to get rid of the weapons or not need the weapons, you first need to take away the feeling that they need to be there. You need to gain an understanding that they're not going to actually bring any happiness or anything positive in the end.
American punk legend Patti Smith was there to spice up the discussions.
I haven't been to Europe since 1979, so I'm probably happier than you know. When I was younger, my band, one of the things we were hoping for then was to open communication, global communication through rock and roll, through music, which I still have great belief in. It's important that we're all involved and we all do our part.
This is really great because it's these people who do have that kind of perspective having dialogues with each other that other people can check out, and that's going to, you know, spread that that level of consciousness.
There are conferences here, like this kind of activities. I do feel certainly, you see, can make some contribution regarding long-term.
And if you want to check out the Peace University, it'll be running in Berlin until the 1st of October.
Young
Okay, I'd like to welcome all participants. Professor Kydland, Mr. Morawetz, distinguished guests, University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce administrators, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the special lecture on peace and economic development in the age of globalization. It is a great honor for the university to host such a special speech given by the renowned Nobel laureate. And this is the second event after the first one held right here at the university on November 13, 2007. And in a few minutes, we will start the welcome remark with Assistant Professor Dr. Sawani Thairungrod, the Vice President for Research. May I call upon Assistant Professor Dr. Sawani Thairungrod, the Vice President for Research, to give a welcome speech about this remarkable event.
Professor Kydland, Mr. Morawetz, UTCC administrators, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce, may I welcome all of you to our second special lecture of this academic year, co-organized by the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce and the International Peace Foundation. This special lecture is held to commemorate the 45th anniversary of University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce and to cooperate with the International Peace Foundation in building up of a culture of peace, which can only be achieved through broad international cooperation among higher education institutions themselves by creating alliances, partnerships with a broad range of institutions, organizations, educationalists, and researchers, as well as with civil society at large. The lecture on peace and economic development in the age of globalization will eventually provide a forum for interested participants to exchange ideas and cooperation regarding the issue on global peace and economy. Through Professor Kydland's insight into driving forces behind business cycles and the time consistency of economic policy, I believe that his lecture will be an effective inspiration for all parties concerned to bring about peace and economic development in today's world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assistant Professor Dr. Sawani Thairungrod. At this auspicious moment, I would like to invite Mr. Uwe Morawetz, Chairman of the Board of Directors International Peace Foundation, to deliver his opening address.
Sawasdee krap. And welcome to the first ASEAN event series, Bridges, Dialogues Towards a Culture of Peace. Bridges is facilitated by the International Peace Foundation, a non-political and non-religious foundation under the common patronage of 21 Nobel Peace Prize laureates based in Vienna. The events are hosted in cooperation with various local partners, including some of the country's major universities. And I would like to thank the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce and its president, Dr. Chiradet Ausowat, for hosting our event today. Having started in November 2007, Bridges is being continuously held in Thailand and the Philippines until April 2008, involving the participation of Nobel laureates for peace, physics, chemistry, medicine, and economics. The first ASEAN series of Bridges is an independent contribution to the Decade for a Culture of Peace and Nonviolence, initiated and promoted by the United Nations General Assembly. It follows a series of 250 Bridges events, which the International Peace Foundation has already hosted in Thailand between November 2003 and April 2005. Bridges has been established as an international, intercultural, and interdisciplinary platform for creative cultures of learning, and continued education for all people. The International Peace Foundation has no concept for peace and no fixed solution how to achieve peace, but we believe that the first step towards peace is dialogue, and the first step towards dialogue is respect. The International Peace Foundation doesn't take sides, but acts as a mediator by creating an independent platform for dialogue where people meet who normally don't meet. People from all walks of life, people who speak different languages, even if they speak the same. As politicians speak another language than artists, and business and religious leaders another one than scientists, it is seldom that they speak with each other or even work together. We live in a world where some people pretend to know the answers and solutions, how to solve problems, how to achieve peace, though the quest for peace lies in the art to pose the right questions. The International Peace Foundation believes that the interconnected problems of our world today cannot be solved only by politicians, only by business, only by scientists, or by religion alone, but by working together. In the Bridges event series, people from all walks of life meet in a multidisciplinary program to find creative solutions to solve problems and to achieve peace. Peace within ourselves, within our family, within social structures, peace with nature and the environment, peace between nations, cultures, and religions. Peace is a process. Dialogue is a process. It is nothing which can be achieved instantly. It needs time. This is why Bridges is not organized as a single conference, but as a series of events over the period of 6 months in which Nobel laureates from all fields build bridges with leaders in all parts of society and with the general public. Peace is not something which can be left to the elite of a few, but which needs the participation of everyone. Only if many ways cross and people walking these ways meet, can international understanding be achieved and problems commonly solved. If we listen to and learn from each other, we may discover that there is not only one way to achieve peace, but that there are many ways, and certainly ways we have never thought of to go. May I now invite you to listen to and share your views with Professor Kydland, the 2004 Nobel laureate for economics, who has agreed to come to Thailand to help build bridges. We all look forward to his keynote speech and to his important contribution. A warm welcome, Professor Kydland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Uwe. Now it's time for the highlight of the event. May I introduce you a bit before you give the keynote speech? Today, I have the singular honor and privilege of introducing our keynote speaker, who is a Norwegian economist. He earned a bachelor degree of science from the Norwegian School of Economics in 1968 and a PhD in economics from Carnegie Mellon in 1973. Currently, Professor Kydland is the Henley Professor of Economics at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He also holds the Richard P. Simmons Distinguished Professorship at the Tepper School of Business of Carnegie Mellon University. And for his award and honors, there are plenty of them. May I introduce only a couple? Alexander Henderson Award, Carnegie Mellon, 1973. Bank of Sweden Prize in Economic Science in memory of Alfred Nobel, 2004. And for his teaching and research interests, Professor Kydland's area of expertise are economics in general and political economy. His main areas of teaching and interest are business cycles, monetary and fiscal policy, and labor economics. And you'll find that we see that our keynote speaker is an active researcher. I have read your autobiography, and it's some kind of very long. And I find that he frequently publishes analytical reports with catchy names like Theory Ahead of Business Cycle, Measurement, On Time to Build, and Aggregate Fluctuations. It's no doubt that he befits Nobel Prize winner. That is, on 11 October 2004, the Royal Swedish Academy of Science announced that Professor Flint E. Kydland of Norway and Edward C. Prescott of the United States of America have been awarded the Nobel Prize for their contributions to dynamic macroeconomics, the time consistency of economic policy, and the driving forces behind business cycles. And his today talk, as you know, it will be on peace and economic development in the age of globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, please all welcome 2004 Nobel Laureate for Economics, Professor Flint E. Kydland.
Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. First, I'd like to say how happy Tanya and I have been to be in Bangkok since Thursday. We've had a wonderful time. And of course, I thank the university for contributing to putting this together, and Uwe Morawetz for inviting me. Of course, you all should know that if Tanya hadn't agreed to come, then I wouldn't have been here. So I have as a rule, I don't travel outside the continent of North America unless Tanya comes along. So my beautiful and wonderful wife is right over here. So the idea that there is a connection between peace and economic development is one that I think many would agree with. Personally, I believe strongly that deficient economic development often comes in the way of peace. An example of someone very much into the peace effort who apparently thinks the same way is Elie Wiesel, the Peace Prize winner from a number of years ago. He has invited me to come to his annual conference now 3 years in a row. The fourth conference will take place as always, in Petra, Jordan. It will take place in June. And this is a conference primarily of Nobel laureates from different areas, but Elie Wiesel is smart enough to invite some other people to come along, and usually experts in their field or government official and so on. These are conferences to think about how to save the world or how to build a better world. And in these conferences, we're all divided into 4 groups. And one of the groups has always been the group discussing economic development. I admit that I didn't work so closely in that area before, and it's partly through the participation in Elie Wiesel's conferences that my interest in this area really took hold. Of course, some of my work has been related to economic development, and much of what I'll say today is connected somehow to my research. I always get nervous if I'm asked to talk about something that's not related to my research, and so I'll continue that tradition. Now, before I really get into the subject, I want to show you some charts. Here's a seemingly random collection of nations describing real GDP per capita since 1950, from 1950 to about 2005. These are real magnitudes. They're taken from the World Pen Tables, as they're called. There's always some issue about how to convert GDP in different countries to measurements that are comparable. But these have been converted using purchasing power parity translations. So you see one of probably the leading country in terms of growing GDP per capita is at the top of this picture, the United States. Then there's Hong Kong, Canada. I even have, I believe, Thailand in this picture. I'm standing a little to the side, so I can't quite, maybe I'll stand here now. We do have Thailand here, and that would be this curve. I guess you're all familiar with the idea that things look very promising on a path that maybe should have gone like this, but then 1997 came, and am I in your way? And there was a decline, and then we have sort of recovered now. But still somewhat below some of these other countries. I want you to take note of Argentina, for example. Argentina used to be one of the most well-to-do countries in the world. Argentina has really, really slowed down compared to the other countries. One thing about this picture is there's nothing particularly spectacular about the fact that these curves are getting steeper and steeper. That's just a reflection of when a 5% increase here when you're starting from a much higher base is going to be a larger distance than 5% here. There's a different way to show growth pictures that sometimes are more revealing, and that's to put them in proportional scale, to take the logarithm at first, because then a constant growth rate will show up in a picture as a straight line. Here, a constant growth rate gets steeper and steeper. But for my purpose here in the beginning as kind of motivation, I want to be able to compare these magnitude, the dollar values of real GDP per capita. And you see the scale goes from 0 to 40,000 and that would be as of dollars at the end of the sample. Here's a picture of European countries. These grow quite smoothly, and the rates of growth are not that different. Traditionally there were some laggards, such as among these particular 8 countries, Greece and Spain used to be lag behind, but they've started to catch up. And the nation that I really want you to notice, we have Ireland here. They used to be right in there with Greece and Spain. Look at how it's really grown dramatically since 1990, and it's caught up with Denmark and Germany, France, United Kingdom. It's up there at the top. And experiences like that, or natural experiments almost, are very, very valuable to economists, and the idea you can learn a lot from it. Now, I'll show you another set of countries. The first thing to make a note of is, in both of the first 2 pictures, the scale goes from 0 to $40,000. This picture goes from 0 to $3,000. So back in these pictures, we've been talking about from here to here. Nothing up here. Well, these are very depressing pictures, and one of the points to make in the context of my talk today is we all know that many of these countries are characterized by unrest of different sorts, and whether whether one causes the other. I mean, is it a lack of economic development or that causes unrest, or unrest that causes lack of economic development? That's not always so easy to establish. But the fact is, these countries have not done very well, and not just in terms of being very low in levels, but look at how volatile their GDP per capita is. Some countries are doing reasonably well by comparison. For example, I guess the one that most reliably has been growing is Lesotho, and Lesotho is sort of an interesting country because it's sitting there right. It's a small country in the middle of South Africa, and I mean its entire border is with South Africa. Many of their people work in South Africa, so this Lesotho is an example macroeconomists use to show the difference between GDP per capita and gross national income per capita. For the United States, for example, they're virtually identical. And for many countries, they're very similar. For Lesotho, they're quite different because so many of their workers go to South Africa and work and then come back with their income. So if I had drawn a picture of income per capita, probably Lesotho would have been quite a bit higher. But some of these countries are doing very, very poorly. Republic of Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo. I brought this picture before the recent unrest in Chad, and so you all heard that there's trouble in Chad these days. Chad is right here, and one thing I now realize I forgot in the previous picture. One of the countries I have, the yellow one, is Afghanistan. Afghanistan isn't doing very well. So these three pictures were meant to be sort of motivational, and let me just give a quick overview of my talk. I'll talk a little bit about the modern framework of macroeconomics because everything I do is based on such a framework. Then I'll talk about an aspect that I think is important for economic development. Economic development is a wide field. It's a very broad field, and there are so many subjects I could have talked about. And as I already told you, I'm going to focus on some things that I have focused on myself in my research. And this is one thing Prescott and I discovered, and this was already mentioned in the introduction. I'll give you some acute examples. Well, first of all, I'll try to explain the fundamental reason for what we discovered, the policy inconsistency problem. And it's not so easy to explain necessarily to non-specialists, because when Prescott and I first presented it, everyone was convinced that we were wrong. And so there must be something a little difficult about understanding it, but I'll do my best. I'll give you some acute example, maybe cute as well. I'll talk about two countries. I happen to have studied them more closely than, almost as closely as I've studied the United States and Norway, and those countries are Argentina and Ireland, and I'll talk about them because I think there's so much we can learn from them. Argentina, I regard as an example of what happens under bad economic policies and the result of lack of economic development. Ireland, an example of good economic policy. And then I'll have some more general comments at the end about what is it that fosters economic development, or on the other hand, what hampers economic development. Now in these two contributions that were mentioned that were focused on by the Nobel Committee. This I think is one of them, namely that Prescott and I showed how to put people into economic models. So we're explicit about people's preferences over time. Almost everything I know about in aggregate economics or macroeconomics is dynamic in nature. It's forward-looking. And for that reason, the preferences, we don't look at them just as they apply to this month or this year even, but far into the future. Modern economic models are explicit about the budgets of the individuals or about, should say, and the resources within which a nation must live. And I talk about resources in the form not just of goods and services and so on, but also time. Time is a very important resource. So as I mentioned, modern model economies are explicit about about people's dynamic decision problems. I mention this because it's kind of crucial to the time consistency problem. Modern economies, model economies, these can be programmed into tiny laptop computers, for example. They also contain thousands of businesses. And it's fair to say that you don't read any papers these days that doesn't have an explicit description of an aggregate production function of some sort. Some description of how you can convert capital in the form of factories, machines, office buildings, and so on. Can convert physical capital on the one hand, the workers, the labor input of the workers, into output of goods and services. So that's what the aggregate production function does in such a model. It describes in an amazingly accurate way in terms of describing the data for most countries, how this goes about. And a very important portion of the aggregate production function is a description of how nations typically become better at doing it over time, what we could call technological change. And this is key to, I'll get back to this later, but this is key to the long run growth of nations. Now, one should note that when I say technological change, these are models at relatively high level of abstraction, and there are many things that could play a role that you wouldn't necessarily think of as technological change. Just to take some example, it turns out the major oil shocks that took place in the 70s and early 80s, they worked as if the economy had been hit by a negative technological shock. There could be changes in regulations facing the business sector. There could be the government's provision, an increase in the provision of infrastructure would be a positive factor seen from the aggregate production function. I always used to mention an example such as a banking panic. Banking panics, for example, as we've seen not that long ago in Latin America, they would be an example of something that it's as if there were a negative technology shock. The banks provide a very important function as intermediators between savers and investors, and if financial intermediation doesn't work as well, that's like throwing sand into the operation of an otherwise well-functioning economy. Now, of course, more recently we've seen what's sometimes called the subprime mortgage crisis, and there are signs that could work not as dramatically as a banking panic, but it could affect banks' behavior at least for a while and be a negative shock. Just to mention, this is not so central to my talk, but let me just say that what I personally like to do is quantitative theory. And so I'm interested in questions whose answers are should be numbers, that should be answers in form of numerical magnitudes. Now, in order to get credible or reliable answers, we need to calibrate the economy. Just as it's like a measuring device. If I took a thermometer outside today and it's filled with mercury, the piece of glass is filled with mercury, I would not trust it unless I knew it was calibrated to give the right answer to questions whose answer I already know. And the two key questions are, where would the mercury end up in a pot of water with floating ice in it? Okay, if it says 0, then that's good. That's a good start. And you stick it in a pot of boiling water, and if it says 100, then I would trust it if it says 28, if I take it outside today. And the same way with these model economies, they need to be calibrated to give the right answer to questions whose answer we already know, and then we trust all the more the answers to the questions we're looking for. So I've talked about the role of, or the inclusion of the household sector, basically. Millions of people, millions of decision makers, the business sector, and but we can also introduce the government, and that's really the key to much of my talk. We can think of economists like to learn from very stylized examples. Now, it's true that the world is not quite as simple as these stylized examples, but it's amazing how much you can learn from these stylized examples. So let's just imagine a idealized world where we have a benign government. The government has an objective that, suppose it reflects well the welfare of people. It reflects well the preferences of the people. And the government has a budget constraint just like you and I. So suppose the government has an unchanging budget constraint. We don't worry about change of the governments. A complication, of course, could be that there is a change of government and the new government has a different objective. But let's save that complication for last. Let's just assume that there's no change in the objective of the government. It's the same over time. What Prescott and I found was this surprising thing when we first saw it, but if you think about it, it's actually reasonably obvious. This optimal government policy, suppose you calculate, you plug in a description of the economy, you plug in government's objective, its budget constraint, and then you calculate the best policy the government could follow. It turns out this policy generally is inconsistent over time, and it requires what we could call a commitment mechanism to be implemented. Otherwise, there will always be this temptation, it turns out, for the government in the future to change to a different policy than the one that was calculated at time 0. And worse than that, if they do so, the alternative outcomes can be very bad for the economy. The fundamental reason for the inconsistency is a little bit complicated, but here's what's the case in a dynamic economy, a forward-looking economy. There are lots of decisions where if you're rational, you think you try to think far into the future. It applies to businesses thinking about expanding their capacity, building new factories, installing more modern machines, thinking about whether to engage in innovative activity, and so on. These are forward-looking decisions. Similarly, for students thinking about how much education to accumulate, or for people to think about how much to invest in new skills for doing work better. Suppose you were to think about buying a 20-year government bond at a nominal interest rate. These are forward-looking decisions. Some of these decisions involve heavy expense today. The returns, the revenues are spread over maybe 5, 10, 20 years into the future. You want to have some idea what the environment is going to be like in the future. And for example, in investment decisions, what matters to those decisions is the revenue that accrues to the businesses after, and therefore to the owners, which are typically the households, after taxes have been paid. So one of the things to try to predict about the government is to what extent will the returns from the investment be taxed in the future. So the optimal plan for the government, planning for today and the future, takes into account the effect, the future portion of the plan, the effect it has on decisions today, decision this year, and so on. Because the private decision makers try to anticipate the future government policy. Now, so suppose we fast forward. Suppose this has been done, calculations have been made, policy is being implemented, and so on. We fast forward, say, 5 years into the future. Now, 5 years worth of these decisions among private decision makers, they have already been made. And so the key reason for this tendency for the government to want to change this policy, possibly, unless they're really committed, the key reason is for the continuation of their plan, it took into account the effect it would have on decisions that have already been made. Well, those decisions have already been, they hadn't been made when the plan was made, but now they have been made. Why take into account those effects any longer? And so there will be a tendency for even a benign government to wish to change its policy from then on. Well, I said I would give you some acute examples. And typically, this problem hits hardest when we're talking about accumulating something over time. So the temptation could be to increase the tax on physical or human capital. Politicians are quite good at coming up with reasons why we're in an emergency and we need additional revenue. Suppose under my scenario, expecting a benign environment for investing in the future, in future capacity, business had taken advantage of it, and so on. Well, once these factories have been built, if the government said, "Oh, we fooled you, we're going to raise the taxes on your income now," most of those factories would still keep operating. They would not close down just because of this change in the government policy. The government might say, "Well, we're in an emergency. We're going to raise taxes, but we promise to go back to the original taxes in the future." Yes, right. Well, you might be fooled once, but that's that trick couldn't be used more than once at most. Another example could be to partially renege on, or I could just as well default on government debt through surprise inflation. If the debt has been issued at, say, a nominal interest rate of 6%, that implies some value of these government bonds. If at some point in the future the government decides to run a surprise inflation, the real value, the real amount of revenue the government needs to pay back those bonds would drop dramatically. And this is something that, I mean, I assume these scenarios don't sound far-fetched because this is exactly what has happened, especially this latter example has happened many times in Latin American countries. It happened in Russia. It has happened all over the world, basically. Some countries seem more committed not to do so, but it takes some doing. And there have been examples where governments have tried special mechanisms to commit themselves for the future. And the three examples I have here are mostly in the context of monetary policy. In the 19th century, and somewhat into the 20th century, the gold standard was quite prevalent among many countries. The value of the currency was tied to gold as a way to commit to increase the credibility of your country. Eventually, the gold standard fell apart, and maybe that is a reflection of how difficult it is really to commit yourself in the very long run. Argentina tried a currency board in which they accumulated reserves of US dollars, and they promised they would tie their peso to the US dollars. This was done when Carlos Menem took over in the early 1990s after a particularly bad decade of hyperinflations and big drops in economic activity, depression actually. So the currency board was tried as a way to shore up the credibility of Argentina and their currency in particular. That fell apart as well, and one reason, without going into big detail, was they took care of the monetary policy part, but forgot to, or maybe it wasn't practical to shore up fiscal policy. Monetary and fiscal policy are related. And in Argentina, it was particularly difficult from a fiscal side because the provinces could borrow almost at will and, of course, promise to pay back. But typically, they weren't able to pay back the loans, and then they came running to the federal government. The debt of the federal government ballooned, and then at some point, they felt that they could not hold they could not stick to their commitment any longer. More recently, we've seen a surge of, or more and more central banks have become more independent. Bank of England, for example, became independent in 1997. One of the conclusions Prescott and I drew was it would be preferable for monetary policy to be as insulated as possible from political pressure from the rest of the government. And one way to do so is to make the central bank as independent as possible. The world differs a lot in terms of how independent the central banks are. United States is fairly independent. The German Bundesbank was considered to be one of the most independent central banks in the world. Now, of course, Germany is part of the European Union, and so the European Central Bank now conducts monetary policy for a number of countries at once. As I said, Bank of England realized it would be good to become independent, or the government did. Central banks in New Zealand, Scandinavia have become more independent. And in practice, what they often do is commit to levels of inflation targeting, in part because the idea is that it's quite transparent. If they were to deviate from their commitment, it would be, this is the idea, it would be quite transparent. I had thrown in a kind of a subtle point at the second one. Is this equivalent to price level targeting? But I think maybe in the interest of time, if anyone wants to ask me about that afterwards, I'd be glad to talk about it at length. So let me now get to the main driving forces of economic growth or economic development. Well, there are two main driving forces, and this is something that comes out straight out of the aggregate production function and everything we know about macroeconomics. There's the innovative activity, resulting making nations better at producing things with less use of input of capital and labor. Technological progress, we might call it. It's something that it's a process, it's an ongoing process that results from research and development, innovative activity, and so on. So that's a key factor. But we cannot live by technological change alone. We also need incentives to invest in new capital to take advantage of the innovative activities. And by capital, we mean, as I said, factories, machines, office buildings, anything that goes that goes along with the labor input to produce goods and services. Unfortunately, it's the case that many aspects of government policy may be detrimental to such growth. I often say that there's enough uncertainty in the world. The government shouldn't introduce additional unnecessary uncertainty. But unfortunately, that's often what happens in many nations, and that such introduction of additional uncertainty makes it difficult to make, for the economy as a whole, to make the key decisions that will result in insufficient economic development. So here's where I would like to use as an example the country that I have studied particularly closely, namely Argentina. Just to repeat, Argentina is so interesting because it used to be one of the 5 or 6 highest per capita income nations if you go back 120 years. But slowly over time, it's fallen to, it's gone from being one of the most well-developed nations to, well, it certainly needs some doing to try to catch up with the more well-to-do nations. And you remember the picture from 1950 that I showed you at the beginning of the talk. This is an example of a different way of expositing growth. In the first 3 plots I had, it was important for me to be able to compare income levels across these nations. It wasn't so important to see whether growth is picking up or not, and so on. Here I wanted to put the numbers in a proportional scale, and for that reason, mathematically, I've taken log of all these numbers. Or a brokerage firm, if they use this technique, they would say, we put the stock price in a proportional scale. And the advantage of that is that a constant growth rate is a straight line. So this straight line here, for example, represents a particular constant growth rate per year. And as you can see, Argentina did, well, for this period as a whole, Argentina did reasonably well from 1950 to 1980, although if you remember my first picture, not necessarily that well compared to other nations, but by Argentine historical standards, quite well in this 30-year period. Then you see a dramatic drop in GDP per working age person. One nice thing about log scale is I can tell, because this goes from 1.5 to 1.3 or under, I can tell right away that here we had over a 20% drop. 20% drop over a 10-year period in GDP per working age person. That's dramatic. Then Menem came to power. The currency board was instituted. It looked like Argentina was growing quite fast until we got to about 1998. Then another 20 plus, maybe 25% drop in economic activity in the GDP per working age person. And this time over a much shorter period, about half the period of this drop. I can tell you why I got interested in this work, because there was a conference in Minneapolis about studying Great Depressions in light of modern macroeconomic theory, and my co-author of several papers, Carlos Sarsaga, who's originally Argentine, but he's a researcher at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. We were asked to study this Great Depression. And we did, and we came up with some conclusions and so on, and we published our paper. But then we decided to plug in the numbers. Given we had the numbers anyway, we decided to plug in the numbers for the 1990s. And we got a big, big surprise. The surprise was we plugged in the numbers into the model framework that we used to study macroeconomic phenomena, calibrated to Argentine numbers, and the model said, in light of the productivity growth of Argentina, Argentina should have grown much faster. The capital stock should have been substantially bigger by the end of the decade. And just to illustrate that, here are the data. Now these are not per capita or per working age person. This is total real GDP. So that, I mean, obviously there was population growth, so that this per capita drop that you saw, that doesn't show up in the total values. Here's the increase over the starting in the 90s up until about 1998, and then this additional drop. What did the model say should have happened? The model accounts quite well for what happens in the 80s, this bad period, but it says GDP should have grown substantially more in the 90s than it did. The discrepancy is even greater if we look at the capital stock. This is the best measure of the sum of all the capacity to produce in Argentina, the sum of factories, machines, everything. These are the data. The model says this should have happened. And in fact, this extent of growth is over 20% more than actually happened. Now, what could be the reason for that? Carlos and I like to emphasize, I mean, there's never a way to prove anything in economics, but everything is suggestive of the notion that Argentina suffered from what we call the time inconsistency disease. This was due to past hyperinflations. The hyperinflation in the 1980s was not the first experienced by Argentina. And people have long memories. So if they have been burnt once or twice, they're going to be more careful the third time. It's fair to say that the credibility of Argentina among investors was not high. This is one of the most depressing pictures I've ever seen. I mean, it's in the ballpark with the third of the plots I had at the very beginning. This is capital per working age person, starting in the 80s. So here's the level in about 82. Compare that with 2002. 20 years later, the capital stock per working age person has dropped by more than 20%. This is unbelievable almost, and this would have dramatic implications for the ability for workers to have a reasonable income, to have a reasonable wage. People with human capital often do better in bad times such as this than those with less human capital. And so this has had the effect of widening the gap between the more well-to-do and the poor in Argentina. The poverty level has risen and so on. In our opinion, largely because of bad economic policy. It's true Argentina has recovered some recently. Will the gap be closed? Well, if they don't close the gap, then the poor will be poor continue to be poor for a long time. And one of the difficulties, this is something that a nation should always be careful about. If you lose your confidence, if you lose the confidence among investors, it is difficult to restore it, as Argentina discovered evidently in the early 90s. And that's one of the things economists know the least about. I mean, there is no easy answer. If some hotshot young economist comes up with a great answer to that question, for sure he'll be standing in front of the King of Sweden in 20 or 25 years and receive the prize. So, but we do know some things. We do know that it's important that policy is geared for the long run. And that's something I discovered. I've been visiting Argentina every year since 1997. And for some reason, after October 2004, they were more willing to listen to me than they used to. I would get questions from journalists and so on. What do I think about so-and-so policy initiative? And these were policy initiatives that were very short-run in nature. And I would always say, well, I'm not interested in those policies. I want to know what they're doing that would have implications for the long run. So here are some lessons for policy. And I've already touched upon some of them. Government policy must be credible and forward-looking. And here's where I would like to mention the example of Ireland. It's kind of idiosyncratic what why I happened to study Argentina. I was at the Dallas Fed, and I started talking with Carlos Sarasaga about interesting issues having to do with Argentina, and it turns out that there's a lot you can learn from Argentina. Same way about Ireland. Again, at the Dallas Fed, they have a Irish economist, someone born in Ireland, Mark Wynne, and also at some point I had a Irish student from whom I learned a lot. And anyway, Mark Wynne and I decided to take a look at Ireland, and Ireland is very interesting. You saw the picture. You saw how it kind of followed some of the slower growing countries in the European Union for up until about 1990. It was there right in between Greece and Spain, and then it simply took off. What could be behind such an important growth experience? Well, Ireland had already 20 years before 1990, they had already decided to make secondary education free of charge. Students would not pay school money. By 1990, Ireland found itself with a potentially, it was a well-educated potential workforce and potentially highly skilled workforce. But that wasn't sufficient to really get a growth movement started. What did they do? One thing they said, and I like to use that example because it's so forward-looking and for some reason credible. Ireland said, if you come to Ireland and you set up a factory here, these will be the tax rates on your income, not just 1992, 93, 94. They gave the entire tax schedule all the way to 2009, 20 years into the future. And these were relatively low taxes, admittedly rising over time, but everyone knew what they would be. That is, if Ireland were credible. Now, what it is about Ireland to make it credible, I mean, you may wonder why they couldn't pull the same trick that that I described, that could result from the time inconsistency disease. Why wouldn't they say in 1995, well, you already built your factories. We fooled you. Now we'll tax you. Well, Ireland evidently did not have a history of fooling people. But exactly what we can point to make it credible, that's hard to say. But it was credible, and they have stuck to their policy. Now, to avoid the time inconsistency disease, sometimes the right institutions are the answer, and I already mentioned the example of making the central bank more independent from political pressure. How to come up with the right institution when it comes to fiscal policy is a little more difficult, and that's a subject of ongoing research, but it's very important research. As you already saw in my charts, there are large discrepancies across countries in terms of income, and there are some things we know. Low income often is the result of country-specific policies that have the implication of restricting the set of technologies that can be used in that country. It could come about because of the influence of vested interests on the politicians. It could be corrupt politicians. It could be because of unrest in the country. And again, it's hard to say which comes first, the unrest or the lack of economic development. Is it one causing the other or the other way around? It's sometimes hard to tell, but it's got to be they're interrelated somehow. In this day and age, a lot of knowledge is available. With modern technology, knowledge flows easily. There's a lot of knowledge that countries could take advantage of, maybe with the help combined with some nation-specific innovative activity. If they wanted to, growth miracles could happen, such as one of the most dramatic is South Korea, that grew more than sixfold from 1965 to 1990. It's possible. But there's no reason to be, you don't need to be as ambitious as that. The poverty in some of these nations is so dramatic that any sort of, at least somewhat, catching up with the more well-to-do nations is likely to make life much better for just about everyone in the nations. A problem, of course, is that in the very short run, it will appear to some groups of the nation that they're going to be hurt by the adoption of new technologies. Well, in principle, they could be compensated, but of course, the long run is very long. It's 10, 20, 50 years, and just about everyone will ultimately take advantage of such benign economic development. I'd like to end with, this is obviously a little tongue-in-cheek. This is paraphrasing the ending of a book by my sometimes co-author Edward Prescott, written with Steve Parente. They wrote a book called Barriers to Riches. Very interesting book, a nice compact book. You might pick it up and take a look. They end this book by saying that with good policy, there is potential in poor nations for not 1 to 2%, but 1,000 to 2,000% income increase. Obviously, they like to add those 3 zeros to the 1 to 2, but it's not so far-fetched over some horizon. Remember that if we go back to my pictures, the countries that were down to around 500 or less dollars per capita in GDP. Remember that the most well-to-do were up around 35 or 40,000. If you grow by 1,000% over say a 2 or 3 decade period, that would bring you up from 500 to 5,000. That's still not very high, but it clearly would be doable. I think I've done pretty well in terms of my time. Have I spent my 40 minutes? Excellent. This is really my conclusion. I think I made the point all along that, and maybe it's mostly my belief, but I hope I've convinced you that this potential connection between economic development and peace is potentially quite important. Yes?
Professor Kydland, I am very much appreciative of your clear presentation on the global discussion issue. But my observation and some questions on what you have said so far would be that in mature democratic political institutions, there's much more chance to so rule-based economic policy could be carried on consistently over time. But in political turmoil and in situation of political turmoil and very destabilized situation, election is always at the horizon of the mind of politicians seeking to win. Therefore, the objective function of the government as a player would not be the welfare of the people as such that you have assumed in your model. It would be far more winning the election to come with whatever mean it could, like this country in recent years. Plus, the recent election, every political parties turned populist in policies direction so that they can win this immediate election. Given this kind of behavioral framework of government as a player, therefore, what they want to do is to jack up the economic activities so that it look good prior to the election, so that they can win. And you can always see this inconsistency. Plus, if government change so frequently, there will be no commitment over time. Why should a new government try to create a consistent policy over the years? Like in the case of Ireland that you mentioned, that they have tax schedule over a long haul. How could they do that if the government have no continuity and some kind of public commitment that will keep them to? I don't see how it can happen in countries around the world. With this exceptional case of Ireland, you may shed some light in helping us in political economy. How do you constrain the government, apart from the budget, so that their behavior in terms of their own well-being could be pushed towards doing things with rule-based issue? That would be my first comment that maybe you care to comment. My second comment would be the issue of delinking the appointment of the governor, the central bank governor, from the government. Can it be done? Would it be healthy, in your opinion, so that there will be real independence of the central bank, so that your Fed is example is not totally delinked? My country, the finance minister could sack the central bank governor. Therefore, monetary policy usually is always, if you want your job, you better make sure you are not contradicting to the government's wish. What would you think about establishing some way so that governor of central bank cannot be appointed or removed by the politician master? Then my next comment would be the issue of targeting. Would you care to comment if I have written an article recently about, apart from inflation targeting, what about growth targeting, so that it's clear in the mind of the investors where we're heading? What about current account deficit balance targeting, so that you have more, even more rule-based issue apart from just inflation, for example? Would that do, in your opinion, from your research? Can we target a few more things so that we declare it committed to the public what we would like to do in the future? And lastly, I would like to ask you the question about...
I need a list.
Long-term institutional building. What do you suggest if you can have a clean sheet so that you can wave your magic wand? What can we do so that we can create long-term institutional capacity building so that they will be more conducive for the kind of thing you're advocating for rule-based economic policy? If you could have it your way, how do you architecturally create it in economy like developing economy like Thailand? I guess I asked too many questions, but if it's all related to what you have said, and possibly that would be helpful to us to provoke you to answer.
Uwe, do I have 40 more minutes? So on the first question, I sort of alluded to that difficulty. I said, here I'll abstract from the additional complication that comes about because, at least in some countries, when a new administration comes to power, then the objective might even change. So I wanted to emphasize that this is a complication, even if we abstract it from that complication. And that just emphasizes how important it is to think about how to generate continuity over time in governments. You're probably right that it's easier in some countries than in others. In Norway, for example, I'm more familiar with Norway than Thailand. In Norway, the government changes every 4 or 8 years, typically. And if they do, then it's between the Labour government or the Labour Party on the one hand and a coalition of parties more towards the right on the other hand. Amazingly, the large picture doesn't change. Norway has this oil fund, for example, that's being accumulated. It's so far it's up to 1 times annual GDP, and it's projected to be up to grow to 5 times annual GDP by 2020. Norway has agreed on a decision rule for how to spend the oil fund. They have decided the oil fund is to be saved primarily for future generations. Continually, they're under pressure from different sides to spend more of the oil fund. Oh, there are long queues in hospitals. We need to spend more on education. All sides of the government has stuck by the decision rule. It's a very transparent decision rule, and everyone could tell if they deviated from it. So transparency obviously would be a good thing, but no guarantee. I don't pretend to have the answers for the whole spectrum of countries. Well, what I tried to do was just emphasize how important it is to think about these issues and what can you do to set up institutions to facilitate rules or a credible environment that would foster longer run development. Now your second question, now I've forgot a key word to remind me.
The link, the political influence over appointment and removal of central bank governor.
Oh, yeah, so
it's linked somehow.
yes, and more so in some countries than in others. In Argentina, with which I'm familiar, at the bottom of this last depression, the head of the central bank was there was a year when the central bank head was sacked. I mean, new one every time, was sacked 6 times in a year. I mean, that's and in fact, I saw an amazing figure that suggested that the central bank head in Argentina over the past 20 or 30 years has changed more than once a year. Now this just emphasizes how important this issue is, because in Argentina you saw how badly things have gone in Argentina. So it's something to really put your mind to and try to think about solutions. And this would seem to be a case where the solution is quite easy. I mean, you just decide that, okay, from now on the central bank is to be independent, and that's no guarantee, because you need a capable head or a capable governance, of course. But I'm sure in Thailand such a head would not be difficult to find. The third, let's see. So the third was
instead of just inflation targeting, could we target something else as well, like growth targeting?
But that's what Ireland did, for example, using their tax policy. I don't think inflation policy is effective at all in targeting growth. I mean, it's effective in the sense that if the nation's decision makers feel confident that the government is committed, I mean, it's usually through the central bank, is committed to a low inflation environment. That is positive for growth. So I'm not sure what it, beyond that, I don't think there's much the central bank could do. If they follow that prescription, then they're doing their job as far as an environment for growth. Beyond that, what the government can do towards growth comes primarily through their fiscal policy, and that's what Ireland did, and it turned out to be so successful. And your fourth
is the long-term institutional architecture that would create a rule-based consistency that would force the government not to be discretionary.
That's a difficult question to answer, because, and you could say that's a question of ongoing research. It's not going to be easy to think of such solutions, such institutions, especially as they apply to fiscal policy. But they're very, very important questions, and off the top of it, there's no way I can stand here and give you the structure of such institutions. All I've tried to do is emphasize how important that issue is, and I'm giving you examples. I gave you that example from Norway. I was in October. I was at a conference in Costa Rica on arranged by Copenhagen Consensus. There's this organization that they come together. They bring together panelists every now and then to think about what you can do to improve the situation either in the world. They had such a conference in 2004, and they'll have another one in May of this year. But the particular one I went, and the kind of question they ask is, suppose you have $50 billion to spend on whatever project. And there are these 50 alternatives. How would you rank them? And they have experts doing cost-benefit analysis, etc. And then a mixture of Nobel laureates and other economists or other political scientists get together to rank them. I was at the conference in Costa Rica, covered only Latin America. And Latin America it's not just Argentina, but you can find so many countries that are doing poorly, and then sprinkled in between are countries that are doing much better. Chile is an example. And it turns out their constitution is set up in such a way as to make it less likely that inconsistent behavior will prevail. In that panel, I asked the expert who presented the case for different kinds of constitutions, and I said, well, I picked the constitution that the constitutional setup that looked most promising, and I said, is that the kind of constitution that would, for example, deal with the oil fund in Norway the way the Norwegian government has done? And he said, yes, that's exactly the case. Chile has a copper fund, which maybe not in size, but in many ways is analogous to the Norwegian oil fund. And he said, under this constitution, no one would ever touch this copper fund, but if it were the Argentine constitution, it'd be gone in a minute. So, yes.
Professor Kydland,
ASEAN national states? I think your talk is very provocative, and you have given us insight into economic development. I look at the title, you said, Peace and Economic Development in the Age of Globalization. I like to add a few remarks to the debate that you and Dr. Kriegsak have been talking. In my view, I think peace is a prerequisite of economic development. In ASEAN, we used to have a lot of war, among countries. But when we started ASEAN, no more war. And the period of peace has brought us prosperity. So in a way, peace is a prerequisite to economic development. I think your view also correct, that we should say in economic development is not good for peace. I also agree with that. But in terms of economic development, I have given a lot of thought to it. I think there cannot be one-size-fits-all policy to any country, when you want to develop its economy. For example, you are giving a lot of importance to technological change and innovation. That can be applied very easily with developed countries and also middle income. But for countries in Africa, where they are at a very low level, of development, it's difficult to expect them to have, innovation and technological change. In my view, economic development can come mainly from institutional reform. Institutional reform would bring good governance and also rule-based law, and the people would think in terms of no conflict of interest. Then, if you have good institutions in the countries, and also peace, of course, then the economic policy that come out will be good, because people will not think about themselves, will not think about their own gains, they will think about their policy. So I think this, but other factors are also important, like productivity, innovations, technological change, capital input, how you train labor, educations, health, all sort of things that you can bring in when you want to enhance economic development. But another thing that I'd like to say is that when you talk about economic development in the age of globalizations, I think we cannot leave globalization out. We are talking about internal policy, mainly today. But globalization means international rules. There are rules in international landscape, for example, at the WTO, and also a little bit unbalanced power between developed and developing countries. For example, in the trade in agriculture, you will see that the developed country, the EU and also the United States, they still practice subsidies in agriculture, which is not good for developing countries who depend mainly on agriculture export. So I feel that for the globalization to be good to developing countries, we must look into all these laws, regulations that are detrimental to developing countries. I think the book by Stiglitz is also very good. He talked a lot about all these rules, and I concur with him that we will have to facilitate, to make international rules that would be good, that would enhance development. Finally, I would say different country has its own problems. Thailand has its own problems. The other have their own problem in Africa. So we'd have to look at the symptom, just like patients. Then we will come out with good policy. But first, it must be healthy, it must have peace, and it must have good value. Jariya Thama in Thailand, institution must be good. Thank you.
Excuse me, may I interrupt? For the criticism, probably we can have like a talk after this, after the talk, okay? And we have enough time only for one question, because we'd like to finish by 4 p.m.
May I? Okay. As the topic, the peace and...
Well, could I... There's
else?
not much I could comment on. I mean, you bring up some very valid points. The only thing I wanted to say is that When I said talk about the role of innovation, remember I said there's a lot of knowledge available. So I didn't necessarily mean that these countries would do all the innovative activity themselves. And I suppose that's where globalization comes in very powerfully, because now you can import knowledge from all over the world, possibly combined with country-specific innovative activity to make it applicable to your country. Now, that could apply not just to being able to produce output efficiently in factories, but even things like knowledge about types of seeds to use to make agriculture more efficient while the economy is building up from a low level. But in general, I obviously I support many of the points you bring up also about the role, the bad role some countries' subsidy policy could have on the rest of the world. Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
May
Yeah,
I have
one question,
opinion?
please.
Yes, it's very good.
Would you please?
Yes, to attend here peace and economic development in the age of the urbanization. I have seen, and just 2 or 3 minutes. First of all, I think in the world, globalization should be escaped from the military fighting. Okay. The second is is it possible, because you are noble in economics? Is it possible for the Asia bond to Asia dollar, because euro we have it? Okay. The second one is Asia dollar. How do you think it? And third is many of the macro in economic development. I have a see about I have a note, but this is the Kydland Canal. The Kydland Canal is a safe 2 or 3 days from the Russia to the east to the Europe, not only plus to the Sumatra Channel. Is this possible or not? I think I should be have all these 2 or 3 points like that.
I apologize. I guess your microphone was kind of blurry. I had trouble picking up your.
First is it possible for the Asia bond to Asia dollar? The second is the
possible for what?
Asia dollar.
Oh, to have an Asian dollar?
Yeah, euro dollar. Okay, we have it. Asia dollar, is it possible? How do you think? Okay, the second is the Kydland Canal. We have the Panama and the Suez and the Kydland Canal. Is it possible? Okay, only 2 topics in the future or the next seminar. Okay, thank you.
If I understood the questions right, I'm not sure I'm the right person to try to answer them, but it's possible I simply misunderstood. I'm sorry.
Okay, probably I'm sorry to interrupt. We can continue the discussion after the talk when we have the reception out there. Okay, and everyone is welcomed after this. So on behalf of the organizer, I would like to express my sincere thanks for this great lecture. More or less, we realize how economic policy plays a significant role in developing countries, how it brings the poor nations of the world closer economically to the well-to-do ones. And on this auspicious moment, could I have the honor of the President of the University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce, Associate Professor Dr. Jiradet Usawat, to give a token of appreciation to Professor Kydland. Okay. On the stage, please. Thank you very much. And here comes the last part. Professor Kydland, Mr. Morawetz, distinguished guests, University of the Thai Chamber of Commerce administrators, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the organizers, International Peace Foundation, Bridges, and the University of Thai Chamber of Commerce, may I express our sincere thanks for your active participation to this special lecture. I also wish to extend my gratitude to all the sponsors of this event, BMW, Dusit Hotel, Ogilvy, and Thai Airways, for without their big support, this second special speech will not be possible. And we would love all participants to enjoy the reception after this special moment, and you can have a chance to probably chit-chat with Professor Kydland after this. And before you have the safe trip home, we'd like to call you back for our third event in early March. So we'd like you to be here again. Thank you very much. And the organizer would love to have the group picture with Professor Kydland in the front. The group picture in the front, please. Professor Kydland, Mr. Uwe, and the guests. Dr. Sawani, the president.